Hi, I'm Deborah from Fish Museum and Circus, and I want to talk to you about trims, specifically about inserting trims into seams. I use trims in a number of my sewing patterns, and mostly they are inserted into seams. This is my Sewing Fairy pattern, and you can see that in this one, the hair is ball fringe and it's inserted right into the head seam. The Pocket Friend blanket has a piece of rickrack that's inserted into the pocket seam, and also ribbons that are inserted into the seams of the friend. The Magic Pockets pattern, which is really customizable. You can do so many different things with it. This one, which is the sample from the pattern, has fringe that it's inserted to look like hair. The So Good pin cushions is also very customizable. This one I put some ball fringe around the top seam. The Sewing Smiles doll has ribbons inserted into the seam for the hair, and also, again, some rickrack on the pocket. And my new pattern, Thingamalle Friends, will be out at the beginning of 2027. They are three different friends. This is Bartholomew, and they all have rickrack inserted into the seam between the head and the body. This is Flora, and she also has rickrack in between the head and the body. So that is a pattern that is coming in early 2027. So there's all different kinds of trims that you can use. My favorites are ball fringe, and they come in all different colors and sizes, and rickrack, also all different colors and sizes. And I also have some fringe here to talk about as well. Let's start with the rickrack. Rickrack comes in cotton, rayon, and a combination of different materials. It just depends on where you get it from and what manufacturer it's from. It also comes in a lot of different widths. And sometimes it will have the widths in millimeters and sometimes in inches. I usually use inches just because that is what my rulers have and what I'm used to. This one is a 1/2 inch wide, and we're going to start with that because I use mostly 1/4 inch seams in my projects. And when we use a 1/4 inch seam on a 1/2 inch wide rickrack, the seam will go right down the middle. So if we have our fabric and we put the rickrack right on the edge here, and match up the edge of the rickrack to the edge of the fabric. And if we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, the stitching is going to go right down the middle. So we're going to start with that because that is the most convenient size, really, for when I'm sewing my projects. The first thing that I'm going to do is sew along the edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance so that it will hold the rickrack in place. When I put the other piece of fabric on top for my 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I will know that everything is right where it's supposed to be. So I've sewed this on with 1/8 of an inch approximately seam allowance, and now it's right where I want it to be when I put this other piece on top. And I'm going to line up the edges, and I'm going to stick a pin or two just to keep the fabric together. And then I'm going to sew this at the 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is the final seam allowance. So I sewed this at the 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can see on the other side where that 1/8 inch was when I sewed on the rickrack to keep it in place. And if you open it up, you can see now you have a nice edge. So depending on what you're sewing together, you can press this so that the rickrack goes in one direction. If you are going to be doing something where you want it to be like this on Flora where it's going in one direction, or you can press both sides away from the rickrack so that you have something like what's on the pocket here. So the both sides are pressed away from the rickrack. So you have this nice little edge there. Always be careful when you're pressing trims. This is a cotton rickrack, so it will be fine with your iron, but if you have any synthetic materials, you want to be really careful about the temperature of your iron and how you are pressing it so that you actually don't melt it. So what do you do if your rickrack is not exactly twice the size of your seam allowance like we just did? So these are bigger. This one here is about 1 1/8 inches wide. It's a very big one. This one is not quite so big, but still it's about 3/4. So if you're going to do a 3/8 inch seam, this would be fine, but with a 1/4 inch seam, you are going to get the seam to be a little bit towards one side, which is fine if that's what you'd like. You could simply put this on the edge, do what we did before, which is sew this on with 1/8 inch, and then sew your 1/4 inch seam allowance with the other piece on top, and you're going to get these little open spots, and that would be fine. But let's say you do want to have the seam go right down the middle. There are lots of ways that you can do this. If you move the rickrack past the edge of the fabric 1/8 of an inch, and then you do your 1/4 inch, you will get that same effect. It's a little bit harder to line things up. Or you can actually trim down the rickrack, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to trim down the edge of this rickrack so that the 1/4 inch seam line goes right down the middle. So I have the 1/4 inch mark on the ruler going right down the middle. You might have to adjust your rickrack a little bit. And then you can see that there are these little edges that are sticking out here, and I'm going to cut those off. Now I can match the cut edges of the rickrack up with the cut edges of the fabric and do the same thing that we did for this piece, which was stitch along the edge 1/8 of an inch to keep it on, put the other piece of fabric on top, right sides together, and then sew your 1/4 inch seam and turn it inside out, and you'll get a bigger edge, a bigger rickrack, but also just the scallops on one side, not any of the extra spaces or anything like that. So what do you do if your rickrack is narrower? This rickrack is only about 1/4 of an inch. So if we put this on the edge of the fabric and then used a 1/4 inch seam allowance, the rickrack would just disappear into the seam allowance. So we want to move the rickrack in a little bit so that when we sew the 1/4 of an inch seam, it will go down the middle of the rickrack. So how do we do that so that we know exactly where to place it? The first thing that I'm going to do is actually draw a line in the seam allowance. There's a couple of ways to do that. This is a Hera marker, which makes an indent. You could use that. You could use a chalk pencil or any kind of other kind of disappearing, washable, or air disappearing kind of pencil, or a regular pencil. And I'm actually going to use a regular pencil because it's going to be in the seam allowance. I'm going to make a line that is 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so this line is 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And now I know that this is where I want my rickrack to line up. That's where I want the edge to be. Now I'm just going to double check if my 1/4 inch seam allowance is used. That is going to go basically right down the middle. Okay, so now what do we do about making sure that this stays in place? Because what happens is that if you just use 1/8 of an inch, you're not going to actually catch the rickrack. So we're going to move that just a little bit further in, just a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch. So now I've stitched this down just inside the 1/8 of an inch line that I drew. It's hard to see the line because it really is very close to the stitching, but you see I've caught the edges of the rickrack all the way along. Now we're going to add the other piece on top, right sides together, and stitch the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I've stitched the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. You can see how the rickrack doesn't go all the way out to the edge, and you can see that extra stitching line that kept it in place. So now you have this nice, really small rickrack edge. Now let's talk about ball fringe. And ball fringe is like rickrack in that it comes in all different colors and sizes depending on where you get it. This one is going to be a little bit narrower. This one's going to be a little bit wider. And you can see how the header, the part that's up at the top here, is, even if they're the same, fairly the same width, the headers are going to be different, and the ball fringe part, the ball part, is going to be spaced differently. It's going to be attached differently. So all of that will come into play when you are sewing it onto whatever project that you're doing. So as I said before, I tend to use 1/4 inch seam allowance on my projects. So that is going to come into play when we decide how we're going to sew these on. I prefer to have just the ball part of the ball fringe showing and the header part in the seam. If you like to have the header, then that's really not a problem. You can do that, but this is the way that I like to do it. So this ball fringe has a header that's 1/4 of an inch. And what I could do is just use this and maybe make it slightly over the edge just so that I didn't catch in this part of the header here. But I would use a slightly more than 1/4 of an inch seam allowance because the header is over the line of the edge of the fabric. So I could do that if I wanted, or I can treat it like some of the other ones that I'm going to show you. But one thing that I do like to do with ball fringe is use a zipper foot. With the ball part of the ball fringe here, it's very hard to get a regular sewing machine foot in the right place that I like to sew, which is just above where the balls are. So I would suggest that you use a zipper foot, which will allow you to get closer. Now for something like this is a 1/2 inch header. So what I want to do is figure out how to make this so that it can be a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, but I can still sew just to the edge here on the other side of the header and right before the balls. What I don't want to do is cut the header down like we did here with the rickrack, because the balls will most likely fall out, and I'll show you what I mean. So if I cut the header down, you're going to be able to pull the balls out. What I like to do, because I don't want to risk the balls coming out and going through the seam and coming out of the finished project, is I like to actually sew basically a stay stitching line on the ball fringe. So I want my stitching line to be here, which is just outside of the header. And I'm going to want to cut this at 1/4 inch because that's going to be the edge of the seam allowance. So what I want to do is stitch it in between those two things. So that stitching line, the stay stitching line, will be inside the seam allowance. So I'm going to sew the stay stitching line 3/8 of an inch from the outside edge of the header. I've sewn the stay stitching line about 3/8 of an inch from the outside edge of the header. And now I'm going to cut the header. And I'm going to cut the header, which is a 1/2 inch header, to 1/4 inch. So I'm going to cut right here. I've lined the edge of the header of the ball fringe up with the edge of the fabric, sewn 1/8 of an inch to keep it in place right on top of that other stitching. And now we can sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've sewed the two pieces of fabric together with the ball fringe in between. And you can see that there is a little bit of the header that is peeking out. And I don't mind that. I don't mind a little bit of it. You might be fine with even a little bit more or most of the header that is sticking out. Or you may want to adjust your measurements just a little bit and make sure that the header is not showing. So it's really your preference. You might want to take a little sample and try it out, and so that you know exactly what measurement you want to cut things to. A little bit of a difference in the seam allowance might be okay depending on which pattern that you're using. If the seam allowance is a little bit different in something like a pocket, that is not going to make a difference. For example, if you have a little bit of a shorter pocket because you made the seam allowance a little bit bigger, you can see this is actually not really quite in the middle. I could have adjusted that seam allowance a little bit, and that's fine also. So because all ball fringe is going to be different depending on the manufacturer and where you get it, you are going to have to adjust your seam allowances and your stitching lines depending on what you're looking for, what you want it to look like. So let's just talk a little bit about this fringe that I have. This silver fringe is fantastic, and I can't wait to use that on something. And then this brown fringe is what I used for the hair on this Magic Pockets. And this was really convenient because it's some kind of imitation suede, so you can cut it however you like, and it does not unravel, nothing comes out. You can just trim it if you wanted to, and that has been, that's a really nice kind of trim to use. And you can also cut the fringe down if you want something shorter. It looks like I did do that for the hair, and I made the hair a little shorter, but you can use it longer. Now, this silver one, this is definitely going to be a problem if you cut it, because there is nothing to hold these on. They stitching goes kind of in between all of the fringe parts, so you would end up just with all kinds of silver threads all over the place. I would actually be reluctant to cut this fringe at all. The only thing that's really holding it together is the fact that they're looped at the top. So to sew this, I would probably have it go over the edge of the fabric, and adjust the seam allowance accordingly so I didn't have to cut it at all. I just want to touch a little bit on the way the Sewing Smiles doll is with her hair, and there are other patterns who have this also. So for example, the Bartholomew's tail is like that also, where there is a bunch of ribbons or trims. This one has rickrack also, that are kind of bunched together to make this kind of pigtail look or tail look. I've just cut a few pieces of rickrack so I can show you how I usually do these types of bunched trims. If you don't have that many and it kind of seems flat-ish, you can just use your sewing machine and go over the edge. And then when you put it into the seam, just move it so that it's over a little bit. And then that little stitching that is holding everything together will be in the seam allowance, and then you'll stitch again when you sew the other part of the piece on top of it. I really like to make sure everything is going to stay in, because a lot of my patterns are items that people are making for children, and you don't want it not to be sewn in well enough, the trims. You don't want anything to be able to pull out. So having them sewn together and sewn into the seam multiple times is totally worth the time. So let me show you how I do that. So I've sewn all across all of the rickrack trim that I'm going to insert into the seam. And you really should sew it wherever you're comfortable sewing it. You don't want anything to get sucked into the sewing machine because it's a little bit tricky. So I've sewn it where it is, and then I'm just going to trim it off. You could trim it off later, but when I put this down here, I just want to make sure that that stitching is in the seam allowance. So I'm going to actually sew this on again so it's in the right place. So now I've sewn that bunch of rickrack a second time into where the seam allowance is going to be. And then when I put the other fabric on top and sew this at 1/4 inch, that stitching will be in the seam allowance. And then the tail, or the pigtail, or however you want to do it, for whichever project you're using, will be in there, and it will have been sewn together and into the seam 3 times and make it nice and strong. There might be occasions where you want a little bit more in your pigtail or tail or whatever it is that you're doing, and it's going to be a little bit too hard to just stitch these together on the end, just like we did before. So what I like to do is actually just tie them together. I do like to use upholstery thread, but regular thread would work fine. And just tie, and not too tight, because what you don't want is you don't want it to be like this kind of hard piece that you are going to have to sew over when you sew it into the seam. So you want it to be a little bit loose. And then it's a little bit easier to handle, where you can kind of flatten it out, but it's all tied together and you don't have all these pieces. And then you can sew it onto the seam. Here within the seam allowance. This is also a good place to use your zipper foot, just because it will make it easier to go over everything. And you might need to change the pressure on your presser foot so that you can go over this bump here and also go back and forth and make sure that it's really in there and it's really attached. Be sure to visit Fish Museum and Circus for all of my sewing patterns in PDF and paper, including the Pocket Friend Blanket, Sewing Smiles Doll, Magic Pockets, Sew Good Pin Cushions, and Sewing Fairy, and find Thingamo Friends in early 2027.